Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third and final live session for this NPTEL MOOCs course on the environment and development. I've received a few queries and I'll address those in the last part of my lecture. So you can also at the same time log in and post your queries, which I will try to respond. And before doing that, what we do is try to have a brief discussion on what we have done in the last couple of weeks, as I had done earlier in the other live session. So we will go slowly, like thematically, and more importantly, what we have done in the last couple of weeks is on a theme and title as Indigenous Knowledge, Environment and Development. So in that, we try to familiarize ourselves with the concept of indigenous knowledge vis-a-vis environment and development. So this very term, indigenous knowledge, has emerged over the last 2 decades to describe the knowledge of a group of people local to a given situations, sometimes used interchangeably with local knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. So the concept of indigenous knowledge has come to play a prominent role in contemporary debates on development. So time and again, indigenous knowledge is seen to be in the opposing or dialogic to this modern technology, and there are no fundamental ontological differences between the various bodies of knowledge these categories usually refers to. So from the instrumental point of view, the rationality of this modern technology compared to the indigenous or local knowledge systems cannot a priori be assumed. Modern technology is always applied in specific social conditions which determine its outcomes. So we have also looked into the differences between live projects and indigenous people, how indigenous communities not just resist development or do not just react to the state and the market, rather they also sustained live projects. What is this live project stance? So live projects are embedded in the local histories and they encompass visions of the world and the future that are specifically distinct from those embodied by projects promoted by the states and markets. And live projects also diverse by and large from development in their attention to the uniqueness of people's experience of place and self and their rejections of visions that claim to be universal in nature. Therefore, live projects are premised on the densely and uniquely woven threads of landscape, memories, expectations, and desires of the local people. So we have also looked into the debates between the live projects versus the development projects, how these two has embodied different meanings. So the contrast between the indigenous peoples' live projects as place-based perspective and the universalist visions that justify and shape the development projects, and how indigenous people over time pursue their live projects against those development projects being done at their expenses and in the context of emerging structures of governance and subordination, and how, in spite of indigenous people's willingness to share land and resources with other users, development projects are unwilling to rather recognize and seek to obscure coexistence. So indigenous peoples are, to a large extent, located closer to nature than the modern West. So the dynamics of progress which are being justified, that is in terms of the treatment of the natives along with nature as objects of dominations. That is to say that their life projects are socio-cultural in the broadest sense rather than narrowly strategic. So their life projects are also place-based, but not limited to the local. So in contrast to development promoted by market or state-backed agents, with its claims to political necessities, the greater good and market demands in the context of globalization appears to be disengaged from place conditions. So we then move on to the traditional ecological knowledge and how it is linked to the sustainable development. Now, traditional ecological knowledge is increasingly viewed as a viable alternative to the status quo that caused the problems in the first place. Thus, traditional ecological knowledge has received increased attention over the last couple of decades, particularly in the area of sustainable development. Now, what does sustainable development mean? So, there are two opposing dialogic views on this. From a Western perspective, sustainable development is a concept derived from the conventional Western ideology, and it is perceived to be the product of a particular worldview and its interpretations and implementation which reflect the Western culture and values. So on the other hand, from an indigenous perspective, there are superficial similarities between indigenous views of sustainable development and those of the Western society. So, for example, if you take the creation stories, which provide the fundamental understanding of indigenous people's place in the world, and a concept which, such as environment or traditional ecological knowledge or sustainable development, for which the Aboriginal people are assumed to have an automatic affinity. So therefore, they have categorically emphasized on the coexistence, that is, of recreating an old relations. So therefore, traditional ecological knowledge is all about relationships. And it is not just about understanding the relationships in creation, but also about participating in those relationships. So therefore, traditional ecological knowledge is about sustaining a creative reciprocal relationship with all creation, and also about fulfilling our lives as human beings in relation to the creation. Whereas from a Western perspective, traditional ecological knowledge and sustainable development or sustainability are perceived to be discrete concepts. However, from an Aboriginal point of view, they are intimately related and are in fact part of the same continent. And they are both about relationships. So they are also both about relating to creation in a certain way. If, for example, if people do not take care of their relations, then they are not fulfilling their duties and responsibilities. Rather, they are denying their relationship with creations, and therefore dysfunctions will result. Now, how then we situate local knowledge in the environment development discourse? Because local knowledge, again, is a practical, collective, and strongly rooted in place. And according to scholars like Girtz, it is defined as forms of a relatively organized body of thought, which are based on immediacy of experience. So the very concept that local people produce shared knowledge, which serve as a cultural totem about how we know, which also includes an implicit assumption of people living in close communities and also having a unique ways of knowing. Now, local knowledge is also perceived to be a holistic way of knowing, because in the contemporary times, there is an increasing number of environmentalists and alternative movement activists uh, criticizing the hegemony of science and emphasizing the necessity of creating space for competing modes of knowledge. So according to many of these studies, it is time to also replace the reductionist framework of science with a methodology that draws its guidelines from the non-Western traditions, which are based on holistic of ways of knowing and ecologically evolved learning to live in equilibrium with knowledge. So Western science, for that matter, has for centuries oppressed the rural people and their traditional knowledge, instead of considering them as experts. They should rather admit that they are apprentice and have emotionally to learn from the local people, because they know their environment intimately and they have a deep sense of knowledge of the local ecological system. So now we also then move on to another theme, that is the relevance of indigenous knowledge, which is based on a case study by the author himself. So there are also strong reasons to argue that the ecosystems and biodiversity are best protected by the indigenous people themselves, and this is evident from my discussions about the Kuki indigenous knowledge system, particularly in the northeast India, where the relations to shifting cultivations and socio-religious beliefs and practices are being discussed quite broadly. So we can also, argue that based on my study, that there exists an inseparable linkage between different ecosystems, namely land, forest, water, linking ecology, economics, and ethics, sustainable management of natural resources. So this presentation follows a human approach by incorporating social, cultural, and ethical or spiritual dimensions into it, and recognizing at the same time the inbuilt limitations of traditional economics and the developmental paradigm which are still being implemented. So we then move on to locating the interconnectivity between ecology and the social system, of how traditional societies maintain a close connectivity with nature and also tend to view themselves as a part of a cultural landscape. For example, Jung, that is the shifting cultivation, which perhaps pose it as an integral part of the socio-cultural definitions of many indigenous communities. And because the indigenous cultures again see nature as sacred, because they see it as having a close relations to their spirit world. So therefore, many studies of late has tries to contribute in terms of revealing an understanding, and a realization has in some sense crept in that the ecological health of these fragile mountains is vital not only for the traditional societies inhabiting there, but also for those living in neighboring areas, or more importantly, the foothills and plains. So therefore, there is a symbiotic relationship between nature and culture, making it essential for us to acknowledge the rich traditional ecological knowledge, and thereby forming an important discursive link between the complex and diverse biophysical ecosystem with an equally complex and diverse social system. So the traditional ecological knowledge possessed by these local communities should be validated and integrated as knowledge with that of the formal knowledge in designing the adaptive management strategies with the community participation. So traditional peoples for the successive ages are in close interaction with the natural environment, which has contributed or in terms of shaping their cultural identity, the value system, and indeed the economic well-being. So therefore, in this living relationship, they respect nature as a sacred entity, or for that matter, they give sort of a reverence to the other sentient beings. So therefore, traditional ecological knowledge is the culturally and spiritually based way in which indigenous peoples relates to their ecosystem. And this knowledge is founded on the spiritual cultural instructions from time immemorial and on generations of careful observations within an ecosystem of continuous resilience. So from the works of peoples like Tim Ingold, we could see that for the indigenous peoples, it is in their relationship with the land, in their business of dwelling, that their history unfolds, and both the land and living beings who inhabit it are caught up in the same ongoing historical process. So therefore, indigenous people have their own effective science and resource use practices, which is evident from the works of Paul Silitori. So we can see a lot of relationship and the kind of dynamics between the land and identity, how the relationship between land and identity as the dynamic arena within which social realities are acted out in individual cognitions and perceptions. So therefore, to many of these indigenous communities, land signifies identity, culture, uniqueness, heritage, and so on. And therefore, land composites a part of their social fabric woven around their kinship. So each family is, in a way, given a specific land to cultivate and to take care of their very life and survive. So land and forests, to that extent, provides not only an important element in their livelihood systems, but also security and a sense of belongingness. So therefore, land is inextricably linked to the material and spiritual world, which is evident from the Kuki tribes, particularly in Northeast. So therefore, the land we have also discussed at length about the land use systems, how the livelihood is mainly based on zooming or shifting cultivations, and where they share multiple forms of relationship with land and forest. So we have also engaged on looking at the debates on the zooming vis-a-vis conservations, and also delve at length about the Kuki traditional or indigenous knowledge system, and also examined about the rituals in their agricultural life. So rituals, in a way, particularly in zooming or shifting cultivation, allow the local forms of environmental knowledge to be kept alive, which can be sought to play an important role in the links of ecological knowledge with religious or spiritual practices within the ambit of ecological sustainability and environmental conservations. So I had also at length discusses the various types of rituals which involve or are being practices in and around the zooming practices. So what is evident is that indigenous knowledge as represented in these practices continues to have relevance for not only the communities who are being a case in point, but which can also, particularly play an important role in conserving the fragile landscape particularly in the Himalayan region. Now, I've come to the concluding what we have covered in the last few a couple of weeks. Now, coming to the queries, there are a couple of queries which particularly talk about the nature, the format of questions in the final exams. Yes, the questions format will be the same as that of the weekly assignment, which will be the multiple choice questions types, and which will have a total of 50 questions comprising of 2 marks, which means the total marks will be 100. And there are also queries which says that if one has done the weekly assignments, and will that suffice or be enough for the course? I don't think so, because the weekly assignments have a different weightage altogether, and the final questions has a different weightage. So it will be better to appear even for the final exams. So that will in a way to be in a safer side. So the format of the questions, as I said, will primarily be based on, if one attentively listen through the lectures, and more importantly, if some things are being missed out, you can also please refer to the uploaded PPTs. And if one does this exercise, it will be more than enough for this particular course to write or appear for this final exams and secure a good marks. So I wish you all the best, and hope to meet you all soon again. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.